really good to see so many of our dear friends from South Asia and Central Asia here in Washington, D.C. And I'm just glad that everybody could actually make it here. So that's a big accomplishment. I'm going to just make 2 points, because so far you've been hearing the outlines of a situation that looks really quite, like a looming crisis with a lot of danger on the security side that could spill over from international relations into the local level security. Now, what I want to say, 2 points that I want to come out of this presentation is that, one, when you look at South Asia, actually, from my point of view, the narrative on water is much more cooperative than one would expect. And secondly, that the mindset that produces the kind of alarmist security-based arguments need to be changed by none other than the local communities, where you do find much more, and the local communities as well as the water experts that don't get much say in the national security arena. So really it has to be, something has to change where the communities that make decisions have to much more inclusive from below. So having said that, let me just say, I'll just point out a few things, starting with the fact that the whole idea of, first there was the resource wars, the oil wars, and now water wars. You hear that, and to me, when you hear, in my field, because I do international security, when you hear the words water and war, somehow they don't, to me, the casual eye just doesn't make sense, right? So the point is, to what extent, because in the international relations field, water and war is the rising kind of theme. So to what extent can we see this as the inevitable outcome if we look ahead? I mean, we heard from Marcus and Marlene that there are real dangers. But on the other hand, the question is, to what extent can we shift that into a more cooperative narrative? Now, you have everyone from generals, Pacific commanders and so forth talking about the coming, water wars. The World Bank has even talked about the next century, the wars of the next century will be fought over water. Others talk about water aggression, hydro hegemony, so forth and so forth. And what I suggested in the beginning is that part of this narrative is due to the lack of challenges to this kind of narrative. Because the people who work in the traditional military and security areas, they present a kind of what you call a realist perspective, where you see water controversies between states and see it as an extension of interstate rivalry, and you see it in competitive terms, in zero-sum terms. So the script then gets perpetuated without thinking about an alternative narrative. Now, when you look at South Asia, and I myself was surprised by this, is that when you look at actual on-the-ground situation, and historically, in recent history, there's a much better story out there, but it's much less told, much less well told than the security analysts would have us believe. Well, first of all, like Marcus pointed out, Asia, the water-stressed areas are extreme in Asia, and in fact, Asia as a continent is the most water-stressed, not Africa, as one might actually think. And the South Asian region has already been declared as water scarce. Per capita water availability from 1950 to now has decreased by 70%. And at the same time, this is some of the areas in which you get the fastest economic growth. So it's going to be energy and water intensive. The other special feature about South Asia is the role of India in the position, because whether a state is upstream, midstream, or downstream from the headwaters is a very important factor. And India happens to hold multiple riparian positions, which is rare. It's an upper riparian, a mid riparian, and a lower riparian. So whether there's going to be any water agreement or there's going to be any water conflict, India is going to have to play a key role in any of those things. Now, where would we find the most tense water relationship in South Asia? India, Pakistan. And we all know that, given their history. Specifically, you would find the most potential for conflict over the Indus River waters. Because the Indus River Basin, is a network of 6 major rivers flowing between India and Pakistan, with 1,800 miles of the Indus beginning in the Tibetan Himalayas, so that's controlled by China, and then going west through India's side of Kashmir, and then across Pakistan into the Arabian Sea. Now the key word here is Kashmir. So this is the place where people have seen the biggest potential for conflict, all the way from a nuclear conflict to a cross-border problem. And so, people have described it as a nuclear flashpoint, an intractable problem. The countries have gone to war 4 times, continue to clash innumerable times across the border, and India continues to allege cross-border terrorism with Pakistan and so forth and so on. Now, so the other problem here is that India is the one that controls the headwaters. Although it starts in China, India controls the headwaters into Pakistan. And Pakistan is extremely vulnerable to water pressure from India. To make matters worse, Indus is Pakistan's agricultural lifeline. So all the ingredients for an Indo-Pakistan war over water have been present since 1947, since the partition. You have a wider conflict, not over water, but generally the Indo-Pak conflict. Then you have one party totally dependent on cross-border waters, water scarcity, and also lack of money to build projects that could try to offset some of these scarcity. So what has happened? To what extent have this conventional realist sort of competitive predictions borne out? And especially during times of war, since they've actually gone to war. Well, the actual facts is that against all odds, water sharing between the 2 countries has continued. And as Marcus mentioned, the Indus Water Treaty back in 1960 has continued without a break. And which to me is astonishing when you look at the history of these 2 countries, and especially where that is based, in the Kashmir region. And so it's 55 years without interruption. The treaty says that the 2 parties recognize, in the Article 7 of the treaty says, they recognize they have a common interest in the optimum development of the rivers, and calls for cooperation to the fullest extent when undertaking engineering projects, dams, and so forth on the other side, each side. And indeed, if you look at this literature, the Indus Water Treaty is generally considered the world's most successful water treaty. In fact, it's also one of the most confidence-building measures that exist between India and Pakistan. So what I'd like to say is that this really throws some cold water on the most alarmist kind of inevitability of water wars thesis. And what's interesting is that this kind of achievement is rarely discussed in public. When you talk about India-Pakistan relations, I don't see much discussion about the cooperative elements on this. And so in my own field, we don't talk about it enough. And so this is, working on these sorts of fields has made me realize the importance of bringing people who work on security relations with people who work on water relations and water use. So in a slightly bigger context, can South Asia be kind of a trendsetter when we look at the approaching climate issues and the water stress that is going to be a fact of life? Well, what's interesting is that when you look at Asia, the only treaties with specific water sharing formulas happen to be in South Asia. We don't have them in any other parts of Asia. And they also happen to be between India and Pakistan on the one hand, and India and Bangladesh on the other hand. I told you that India's special position in the scheme of things, so it needs to be involved in all of this. But it's between two of its fairly hostile relations with both countries from time to time. Now, this is not to say that the Indus Water Treaty, to go back to India and Pakistan, has been operating without any problems. That's not entirely true, because each side has been building projects on the other side of the border, especially dams and storage facilities. But again, what is interesting is that criticism and recriminations have been rare. They have been not the norm, despite the situation. And in fact, there is a provision for international arbitration and neutral experts that are supposed to step in any kind of conflict. And what I found was that they only used it once in all these years. And in 2007, when India was building a dam, Pakistan took India to the arbitration, and it was ruled in favor of India, and Pakistan went along with it. So it was not continued to be pursued, except when you see in some domestic political situations where it becomes politicized. So, there have been situations where then one party in the government in Pakistan accused the other of selling out to India because you didn't push it and so forth. But again, it died down. Nobody's really making that into a major issue. Now, just a quick point on India and Bangladesh. Again, what's surprising is that this took a very long time for the treaty between India and Bangladesh, the Ganges Water Treaty, to come about. Again, you've got a situation where Bangladesh is 91% dependent on water coming from India. That's a lot. And Bangladesh, it has a unique problem of having too much water in the monsoon, too little water in the dry season. And they have been, to complicate matters, it's not just the Indo-Bangladesh problem, but it's also the states that are on the border of India that also are against water sharing because it takes away from their water. And so the national government, when it has to hammer out a treaty, has to take into consideration, people on inside their borders as well. So here, the way in which this treaty in 1996 was hammered out after 25 years is something that I think is very relevant to our topic today, and that is that it was made possible through people-to-people diplomacy. That for many years beforehand, the foreign minister in India, I.K. Gujral, had been part of a group, a Track 2 diplomacy group, that involved water experts, that involved numerous groups from either side for meeting. And one of the main things was, how do we get across this big hurdle of the water problem? And when I.K. Gujral became the foreign minister in 1996, practically the first thing he did was to try to negotiate a treaty between India and Bangladesh, and they did. And so it just shows you that it's possible when there is political will. And the interesting thing was that the Gujral was able to withstand pressure from West Bengal and Bihar, which was very resistant to this treaty because it would share water with Bangladesh. And they came up with a very innovative solution, which hasn't been used before, and that is that they said that there would be a certain level of water that would be allowed to Bangladesh during the dry season. So that was a special addendum to the agreement, which didn't exist before. So it shows you that when there's a real political will, you can come up with some innovative kind of solutions. So what does this mean for policy? Well, I think as I tried to say from the beginning is that water can be seen as competitive or cooperative. There's no reason to think of it and start with the narrative that it is a competitive resource and that this is going to be yet another site for conflict where you already have many other issues that make countries, geopolitical conditions and so forth, that make it a big obstacle to begin with. Just to say that in 1999, when India and Pakistan had a conflict in Kargil, which is in the Kashmir region, that at the very same time that they were actually mobilizing for war, that it just happened to be the timing, the schedule that was set up for the joint technical committees of the Indus Water Treaty to meet, and they met. And in fact, that was all other communication had broken down between the two countries, and the only communication was between these two groups at that time. So it just shows you that these things are pretty powerful kind of relationships that can withstand a lot of pressure. So so basically, what I will just end. I'm running out of time. End by saying that there's a much more hopeful narrative, much more hopeful story, and I think that the political will at the highest level is clearly important. I'm not making that into something not important, but I think what is also important is for at the local level to have the people who are really interested in water, who know the water issues, technical people, to be somehow incorporated into the higher levels of decision making, and hopefully these sorts of stories can be used, and especially things like water, the lessons from successful stories at the local level can also be shared between people. And so I think our group, our project from People to People Diplomacy, I think we should be feeling more reinforced at this point. Thank you.